He wasn't asked to release the Comanche girl, but he couldn't put a chain on her heart. Before we begin the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you watched it in the comments. The sun was already high when Jonah Vex rode into Caliche Hollow, the light sharp, dry, and unmerciful. Dust curled around the hooves of his horse with each step, and the leather strap across his chest creaked as he leaned forward in the saddle, squinting against the glare. His shirt, faded from weather and wear, clung to his back with sweat, and the familiar ache in his right shoulder pulsed in rhythm with the horse's gait. An old injury from a rifle stock slammed too hard against bone years ago, and it never truly healed. He hadn't spoken to anyone in 3 weeks. Not since the creek near his cabin went dry, and the last coyote that haunted his nights stopped howling. Silence suited him. He preferred it to questions, to company, to the kind of look folks gave once they remembered who he was, or what he'd done back when the army still used scouts like him. Jonah dismounted in front of the general store. He tied the reins loosely to the post and stepped up onto the porch, boots thudding against the warped planks. He came for a sack of nails, a block of lye, and a bottle of something strong enough to make sleep come easier. He expected a transaction, maybe a grunt or two in place of conversation. What he didn't expect was to be met by Sheriff Hale, standing outside with arms crossed and an expression that already carried bad news. "Jonah," the sheriff said, nodding once. He was younger than Jonah by a few years, though the sun had aged them both faster than time should. Jonah said nothing, just waited, arms slack at his sides, mouth set in a straight, patient line. Hale tilted his head toward the edge of the street, where a ranger wagon was hitched, 2 horses stomping nervously. In the back, beneath the canvas cover, a lone figure sat still, motionless as a shadow. She looked no older than her early 20s, though it was hard to tell. Her dark hair was braided tight against her scalp, and her clothes were torn, weathered, dusty. Her wrists were unbound, but she didn't move. Just sat there, legs crossed, eyes fixed somewhere far past the buildings and saloon. "Name saying, they think," Hale muttered. "Pulled her outta a Comanche camp 3 days ago during that skirmish east of Blanco Creek. Rangers didn't want her. Neither did the preacher, nor anyone else. Says she don't talk much. Don't fight. Just sits." Jonah followed the sheriff's gaze. The woman, girl, really didn't look at him. She hadn't looked at anyone since he rode up. "I ain't here for this," Jonah said flatly, already turning to head inside the store. "You don't have to want it," Hale replied. "Just need you to keep an eye on her. Temporary. A delegation from Austin's supposed to come in a week or 2 to sort her fate. Until then, she needs to be somewhere she won't cause panic or worse." Jonah stopped, turned back. "And you figured I'd be fool enough to take her? You're out of town. You don't ask questions. You've got no family. That makes you the least likely to do something stupid." Jonah looked at Sane again. She hadn't moved a muscle. "I'm not a goddamn halfway house." "No, you're not," Hale agreed. "But you're not a coward either. You took bullets for men who spit when you pass now. I'm asking you, not telling." Jonah let out a slow breath through his nose. He wasn't angry. Anger had burned out in him long ago. What he felt now was a thick, pressing reluctance. This wasn't what he came here for. He didn't want anyone else in his space. Not after the years he spent cutting ties with every face that reminded him of the war or of Emma, his wife who'd left with nothing but a note and the deed to half the land. He didn't want memories. He didn't want company. He didn't want the noise of another person breathing under his roof. But the girl wasn't asking. She didn't plead, didn't speak, didn't so much as glance his way. And maybe that's what did it. 2 weeks, Jonah muttered, already turning toward his horse. "That's all I'm asking," Hale nodded. "I'll send a deputy out with supplies tomorrow." Jonah didn't answer. He walked to the wagon, pulled himself up onto the seat without a word. Sayin still hadn't moved. "You riding up, or am I dragging you?" he asked. She moved then, slowly, without hesitation, climbed onto the seat beside him. Not a word spoken, not a blink of fear in her eyes, just stillness. Jonah clucked to the horses and turned the wagon north, toward the hills, toward solitude, toward a cabin never meant for 2 people. The wagon creaked as it climbed the last slope before the valley opened wide, dry grass bowing under the wind, the cabin finally coming into view like a scar carved into the land. Jonah Vex said nothing the entire ride. Sayan didn't speak either. She sat beside him, her posture calm, her eyes fixed on everything: trees, fence posts, the ridge lines to the west, but never once did she look at him. Her silence wasn't fearful. It wasn't timid. It was deliberate, practiced, like someone who had long since learned that words invited consequences. As they approached, Jonah's dog, a bone-colored mutt named Hatch, came limping from behind the chicken shed and barked once before recognizing his master's scent. He didn't bark again. He simply stared at the girl beside Jonah, ears low, tail still. Jonah untied the horses, guided them toward the corral, and Sayan climbed down on her own. No questions, no command given. She waited while Jonah unlocked the cabin door and pushed it open with the flat of his palm. Inside, the air was dry and stale. The floorboards groaned from lack of weight. A table sat near the window, one chair beside it, another in the corner stacked with tools. The hearth was cold. The bed in the far side of the room had a patchwork quilt that hadn't been touched in weeks. Everything in the place was built for one man and one routine. The intrusion, even by someone so quiet, already made it feel different. Smaller. Jonah gestured toward the bench beside the hearth. "You can sit there. I'll bring in the rest." She nodded once and moved to sit, hands folded over her knees, still and watching him like she had at the wagon. By the time he carried in the sacks and supplies, the sun had dropped low, washing everything in dull orange. The lantern cast long, steady shadows on the walls. Jonah worked in silence, laying the tin plates on the shelf, stowing the flour and salt in the crate beside the hearth. Sayan hadn't moved. He finally set the bottle of whiskey on the table, exhaled hard, then looked at her directly for the first time. "You hungry?" A pause, then a single nod. He poured dried beans into the pot, added water from the barrel, set it over the fire, then struck a match. He felt her eyes on his hands, on the way he bent over the flame, how he stood slowly after. She didn't ask questions, but she observed everything. While the food warmed, Jonah took a basin to the door and poured water to wash. She didn't ask for any, but he set another basin near her feet anyway. He caught her glance, brief, unreadable. She dipped her hands, then her face, never rushing, never looking up again. Jonah watched the fire, listened to it crackle, and tried to keep his thoughts on simple things. How much would he need for next week? Whether the old trap line near Red Creek needed checking. But the silence in the room was louder than he liked. It wasn't just quiet, it was too still. Not the calm of peace, but the silence of things unsaid. He found himself wondering where she'd come from exactly. What had happened before the Rangers found her? The raid had been described as routine, but that word never meant anything good when it came from men who wore badges and carried torches. He knew how Rangers treated captives. He knew what silence like hers meant. It wasn't just cultural, it was survival. The food boiled. He served it plain, just beans and salt. Set a bowl in front of her. She nodded once in thanks, but didn't speak. They ate without looking at each other. The dog rested near the hearth, but kept his eyes on Sayan. Afterward, she gathered the bowls, rinsed them outside without being told. Jonah didn't offer help. He didn't know what to say. She moved with purpose, no hesitation, as if she'd already memorized the dimensions of the place. Jonah rolled out a spare bedroll by the wall near the door and laid a folded blanket on it. "You can sleep there." She nodded. That was all. Jonah sat on the edge of his own bed, removed his boots slowly, rubbed his sore shoulder. He glanced at her again. She'd already laid down, her back to the wall, eyes open but unmoving, arms crossed beneath her head. He blew out the lantern. The room darkened. For a while, the only sound was the wind against the outer logs and the slow breath of two people who didn't know each other, didn't speak, but now shared a roof. And that silence, though it was heavy, didn't feel threatening. It felt necessary. The question some might ask: where's she from? What's her story? Is she dangerous? None of them mattered here. Not tonight. What mattered was that she hadn't run, and he hadn't sent her away. Jonah stared at the ceiling, listening to the sound of breathing across the room. He didn't believe in fate, didn't believe in redemption either. But in that stillness, something felt changed. Not broken, not fixed, just different. And different, for a man like Jonah Vex, was the first crack in a life that hadn't let light in for years. Morning came in slow layers. The light pushed in through the warped shutters, cutting thin lines across the floorboards. Jonah Vex stirred awake before the dog did. Years of military routine had trained his body to rise before sunup, and even though there was no officer barking orders anymore, the instinct stayed. He sat up on the edge of the bed, rubbed his shoulder, and glanced across the room. Sayan was already awake, sitting cross-legged near the hearth. She wasn't looking at him. She was weaving something, working dried blades of prairie grass between her fingers with practiced, rhythmic movements. Her face was calm, unreadable, focused on what her hands were doing, not on the man now watching her from the other side of the cabin. Jonah didn't speak. He didn't want to startle the quiet. He moved slowly, pulled on his boots, and stepped outside. The morning air was already warm, carrying the dry scent of dust and pine bark. He walked to the well, cranked up a bucket, splashed his face, then leaned over the fence line to study the sky. Clear, no signs of rain. The chickens hadn't wandered far. The world looked unchanged, but inside, the dynamic had shifted, and he felt it. Back in the cabin, Sayan was on her feet. She'd swept the floor. The ash from a night's fire had been cleaned out. She'd done it without asking, without being told. She moved around the small room like someone who didn't need permission, who didn't wait for approval. That unsettled Jonah more than defiance would have. He started on the coffee, slow and steady, grinding beans by hand with the old mill screwed to the table. She watched from the corner, arms folded loosely, her attention not aggressive but constant. Jonah noticed her gaze linger on how he scooped the grounds, how he measured the water. He didn't ask why she was watching. He just made enough for two and poured it into tin cups. He set one down near her, then sat with his own. For a long moment, neither of them touched the cups. Then she reached forward and took hers. That was the first thing they did at the same time. After breakfast, Jonah grabbed the axe and headed out to the chopping block near the edge of the tree line. He felt her eyes on him from the window. The axe swung down in slow repetition, the weight of it familiar, the strain grounding. But his thoughts weren't on the wood. They were on the questions left hanging in the quiet corners of the cabin. He still didn't know where she came from. Not exactly. The rangers had said she was pulled from a Comanche camp, but that meant little. She could have been taken from elsewhere. She could have been born in that camp or dragged there. Her silence told him everything and nothing. Was she waiting for someone? Was she thinking of escape? Did she even want to stay alive? Those weren't questions he could ask. Not yet. Not without breaking something delicate between them. By midday, he returned to find she'd taken the leftover cornbread from the tin and split it into two portions. His half was on the table. Hers, she'd already started eating. Still no words. Still no gestures asking permission. Jonah sat, ate, watched her chew slow, steady, like someone used to rationing, someone for whom every bite was calculated. She didn't eat like a guest. She didn't look for approval. She just existed inside his world like she belonged, without asking for room, without demanding space. Her presence was complete and silent and strange. That evening, as he repaired the barn door, he saw movement in the field. Sayan had walked out alone, barefoot, her steps cautious but deliberate. She moved along the creek, stooping to gather something. He couldn't tell what. He didn't call out. He didn't follow. He watched until she returned with a handful of roots, wiped free of dirt. Back at the cabin, she boiled them in a small tin pot she'd found in his cupboard. The smell was sharp, earthy, unfamiliar. She didn't offer explanation. He didn't ask. She left a portion in a small bowl on the side table. For him. Again, not as a guest. As an equal. That night, when Jonah lit the lantern, he realized the chair she sat in had been cleaned, dust wiped from the armrests, the leg mended with twine. He looked over at her. "Where'd you learn to do that?" he asked. She looked at him. Her eyes held his for a moment. Then she looked back at the fire and said nothing. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't fear. It was something else, like she knew her voice wasn't needed yet. and wouldn't be understood even if it was offered. Jonah didn't push. He just sat back, drank his coffee, and stared in the fire beside her. By now, the listener had likely wondered, why is she here? Why isn't she running? Why isn't she afraid? And the truth was, Jonah didn't know. But he was starting to understand that Sayin didn't see herself as a prisoner. And maybe she wasn't. Maybe she saw something in this cabin, in this quiet, that reminded her of something worth staying for, or at least worth tolerating. And for a man like Jonah, who'd built a life on distance, silence, and a long list of things he didn't say out loud, the realization that someone could simply exist beside him without needing anything, that was harder to ignore than fear. She hadn't asked to come. He hadn't asked to keep her. But here they were. No words. No chains. Just a presence that refused to fade. The wagon creaked again as Jonah Vex tied off the last sack of dried hides and climbed up into the seat, reins in hand. The morning sun had barely burned through the low clouds when he set off for Comanche Hollow. The town was a half-day's ride, 12 miles of silence, dust, and heat. He hadn't planned to return so soon, but he needed flour, kerosene, and fence wire before the rains came. Sayin didn't ask where he was going when he saddled the wagon. She didn't speak at all. She just nodded once and handed him a sack with some of the herbs she'd been drying, motioning toward the trader's marks stitched on the cloth. He nodded back. No other exchange. The dog tried to follow, limping after the wheels, but Jonah whistled once and pointed back. The dog stopped. Sayin watched from the porch, her arms folded, hair tied back with a strip of cloth she'd made from his old shirt. She stood there a long while, even after he disappeared beyond the rise. By the time Jonah rolled into Comanche Hollow, the streets had warmed and dried from the night's drizzle. The dust clung to the hooves of horses and boots of men, and the whole town smelled like sweat, old metal, and cattle manure. Nothing had changed, except the way they looked at him. He stepped down in front of the general store, tied the reins loosely, and walked inside without greeting anyone. The bell above the door rang once, then silence. Old Mr. Dunn behind the counter didn't speak either, just raised his chin in acknowledgement, then started filling the list Jonah handed him. A woman near the bolts of fabric stared a second too long. The two men near the tools rack muttered something low between them. Jonah felt the weight of it all, but didn't flinch. He'd been an outsider long before this. People had whispered about him ever since the army sent him home half-healed, still smelling like burned powder and dried blood. Some thought he was cursed. Others thought he'd simply seen too much to be trusted. And now, with a Comanche woman under his roof, they didn't need excuses anymore. He moved to the counter, placed a sack of Sayin's herbs on it, and cleared his throat. "You sell this." Dunn glanced down, opened it, sniffed. "Chamiso. Rare. Good for swelling, fever." "I'll take it." Jonah nodded, said nothing more, paid what he owed, loaded the supplies, and turned to leave. That's when Sheriff Hale caught up to him outside the store. "Jonah," he stopped mid-step, looked over. "You had any trouble?" the sheriff asked. "No," she spoke in. "No." "Anyone come by your place?" "No." Hale scratched the back of his neck. I got asked this morning if I was planning to press charges on you." Jonah stared. "For what?" "For harboring a ward without proper clearance. Apparently someone thinks Sayin ought to be in a guarded building, not in a man's cabin." Jonah didn't speak. His jaw tensed. Not in anger, but in the slow, focused calculation of someone who knew where this could lead. "I told them the matter's under my watch," Hale said. "Told them she ain't locked up because she hasn't done anything wrong. But Jonah, you gotta know, some folks are just looking for a reason to make noise. Let him. She's not gonna run." Jonah met the sheriff's eyes. If she wanted to run, she would have already. The sheriff studied him, then nodded once, quiet. "All right." Jonah loaded the wagon and climbed up without another word. On the way out of town, the same pair of men near the blacksmith watched him go. One spat near the wheel track. The other grinned like he knew something Jonah didn't. The return trip felt longer. The wind had picked up, tossing dust through the dry mesquite trees. Jonah stayed quiet, but his mind worked harder than his hands. The questions pressed on him. Why hadn't Sayin spoken? Not once. Was it trauma? Pride? Or something else? And why was she still there, inside his space, under his roof, with no chains holding her. When he reached the cabin, the sun had begun its descent behind the western hills. Sayan was kneeling in the garden bed, cleaning out rows of weeds. A pot boiled gently near the hearth outside. She didn't look up right away. When she did, she gave the briefest of nods, one that said she had expected him back and hadn't doubted he would return. He climbed down, began unloading the wagon. Sayan walked over silently and picked up the wire spool. She didn't ask what to do with it, just carried it toward the barn. Jonah paused. "You're not afraid of them?" he asked. She stopped, turned. "Of the ones in town." She tilted her head slightly, then shook it once. "Clear." "No." "Why?" he asked again. A pause. She looked at him directly, then turned away. Not answering was her answer, and maybe she had the right to it. They ate stew that evening. She cooked. He cleaned the knives. The dog sat nearby, finally dozing instead of watching her. Something had changed in the balance of the place. The silence wasn't just habit anymore. It had become structure. And for the first time since she'd come, Jonah realized she had never once tried to explain herself. And he had never asked. Because maybe the details didn't matter. Not to her. Not to him. But to the town, whose patience, curiosity, or ignorance might turn dangerous. The details might matter a great deal. He looked out into the dusk. He knew what men were capable of when they got bored, bitter, or scared. And he could already see the shape of something ugly coming down the road. And if it reached her, he'd have to decide whether to act as her warden or something else entirely. The rain came without warning that night. One of those hard, slanted storms that slapped the windows and filled the valley with the sound of water and wind. Jonah had heard it coming an hour before it hit. The sky had gone the color of lead, and the smell of wet earth rode heavy in the air. He'd closed the shutters, tightened the rope around the lean-to, and brought in the dog, who now sat curled beneath the table, uneasy with every crack of thunder. Sayan had moved to the window before the first drop landed. She didn't flinch when the wind howled or when lightning lit up the fields. She just sat cross-legged near the sill, her face close to the pane, eyes tracking the rain as it traced fast lines down the glass. Her expression was calm, unreadable as always, but there was something almost searching in the way she leaned forward, like the horizon still meant something to her. Jonah sat on the edge of the bed, shirt half-buttoned, sharpening his old hunting knife just for the motion of it. He watched her without making it obvious. She wasn't like anyone he'd known, silent, yes, but not passive. She took space without claiming it. She watched everything but reacted to nothing. And that scared him more than if she'd fought him from the start. Because people who said nothing were always carrying something heavier than they could hold. He wondered, again, what she had seen before the Rangers found her. What had been done? Who she'd lost? There were no records. No names. No answers. Just the quiet certainty that something in her life had ended, and that this cabin wasn't part of her plan. And yet she stayed. He poured 2 cups of coffee without speaking, set one on the table. She didn't look over, not at first. Then, after a few heartbeats, she rose slowly, stepped to the cup, and picked it up. She returned to the window and sat down again. It wasn't company, but it wasn't distance either. The lantern swayed slightly in the draft. The dog shifted. The cabin creaked under the weight of the storm, and Jonah realized he hadn't asked her any real questions, not even the simple ones. Not her full name, not her age, not what she wanted, and now he wasn't sure if that was an omission or a form of respect. The cabin was quiet for nearly an hour as the rain hammered down. The wood smoked gently in the hearth, and the flames danced low. Sayan had finished her coffee. She'd set the cup aside and begun pulling apart dried yucca fibers to thread into something, possibly cord, maybe a net, he couldn't tell. Her hands never stopped moving. Jonah caught himself watching the way her fingers worked, slow and deliberate. She looked up suddenly, as if she'd felt his eyes on her. "I was promised," she said. The words were clear. Her voice low, certain, not broken. She didn't look away when she said it. Jonah sat still, the knife forgotten in his hand. "Promised?" he asked, not quite trusting his voice. She nodded once. To someone. Another pause. Then she answered, "To land. To peace." Not to a man. It was the first time she'd spoken in 5 days. The weight of it pressed into the air. Jonah didn't ask anything else. He knew she wouldn't explain. Maybe couldn't. But in that moment, something clicked into place for him. She wasn't waiting to be rescued. She wasn't afraid of men. She wasn't asking for protection. She was surviving a broken promise. That night, they didn't say anything else. The storm carried on outside, and they both sat near the window until the lantern ran low. As Jonah blew it out, he realized something had shifted, something permanent. Her silence was no longer just a defense. It was a choice, and her presence wasn't temporary anymore. Not to him. There was one more question, unspoken, still lingering in the quiet. Would he let her go if she asked? And though he wouldn't admit it, not even to himself, Jonah already knew the answer. He wouldn't, because she didn't belong to him, but somehow the quiet they shared did. The storm passed sometime before dawn. When Jonah stepped out into the yard, the ground was soft beneath his boots, and the trees were dripping, their branches bent under the weight of water. Fog clung low over the valley. The sky hadn't quite turned, and for a moment everything looked suspended, gray, still soundless. Inside, Sayan had already stoked the fire. She hadn't spoken again since the night before, but the single phrase she'd offered, "I was promised," had planted itself deep in Jonah's mind. It lingered like something unfinished, a line from a conversation that would never be completed. But she'd said it, on her own terms. That meant something. He didn't ask for more. He just filled the tin pot and ground the coffee slow, letting the rhythm settle his thoughts. She sat at the table, drying yucca threads beside the warmth. The silence between them now wasn't the same as before. It felt lived in, worn smooth. After breakfast, he headed out toward the pasture to check the fence line. The rain had shifted part of it, and 2 posts near the south edge were leaning bad. He worked methodically, pulling wire, setting the replacement beams into the clay-heavy soil. Sayan appeared without a word, handing him a fresh rail when the last cracked in half under pressure. She didn't ask to help. He didn't invite her. It just happened. He climbed the short slope with a hammer in hand, wiped sweat from his brow, and planted his knee against the post for leverage. The metal was slick from the morning damp. As he drove the last nail, the head of it slipped, then the hammer crushed sideways into the meat of his palm. He swore under his breath, dropped the tool, and looked down. Blood was already pushing through the crease between thumb and wrist. He sucked in a sharp breath, flexed his fingers, and looked toward the cabin, but Sayan was already moving. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't hesitate. She took his wrist, turned the hand palm up, and pressed the cloth she'd carried in her pocket tight against it. Her grip was firm, controlled, without panic. Jonah stood still, watching her. Her eyes weren't on him. They were on the wound. She wrapped it, tied the cloth tight, then stepped back. "Done," she said, and returned to the barn without another glance. Jonah stood alone in the field for a moment, hand throbbing, head full of something he couldn't sort. The cut wasn't deep. He'd had worse. But the way she moved, the way she took over without waiting for permission, it left him quiet. It reminded him of a time when someone else used to care if he bled. Emma, before things broke beyond fixing. He returned to the cabin, hands stiff under the binding. Sayan was stirring something over the fire, a thick mixture of herbs and boiled root. She didn't look up when he walked in. She just set a small tin cup near his place at the table. He sat down. The warmth from the drink helped his gut more than the cut. They didn't speak, but they didn't need to. Later that afternoon, they both moved slow through chores. The rain had washed away layers of dust. Everything smelled fresher, but it also meant rot in the root cellar if he didn't check it. Sayan took care of it herself, organizing the jars, tossing out the spoiled stock, and res-tacking the good ones in rows. She worked with the focus of someone raised to notice what others missed. Her silence wasn't distance. It was discipline. When the evening came, he poured 2 coffees again. This time, she reached for hers before he sat down. They drank outside on the porch. The air was cool, heavy with moisture. Cicadas buzzed in the brush. Far off, a hawk screamed once. Jonah broke the quiet. "How long were you with them?" Sayan didn't answer at first. Then she looked forward and said, "Long enough to forget some words." He nodded slowly. "You want to go back?" She turned her head, just slightly, her eyes fixed on the horizon. No one there now. Her voice was steady, not cold, just final. It answered another question he hadn't dared ask: if anyone was looking for her. He didn't press further. That night, Jonah cleaned his wound. The blood had dried under the cloth Sand had wrapped, and he saw the shape of her care in the way the knot had been tied, tight, deliberate, centered. He let be. Before he turned in, he noticed she'd left one of her yucca cords on the table near his tools. Twisted and strong. Maybe for binding. Maybe just something to keep her hands busy. Either way, she hadn't meant it as a gift. But he took it like one, and hung it by the window. There were still things unspoken between them. Questions about her past. His own broken story. Why she hadn't tried to run. Why he hadn't asked her to leave. But none of that felt unfinished anymore. It just felt like part of the quiet. The sun had already passed its peak when Jonah heard hooves. Not the slow, tired kind from a neighbor's wagon. This was faster, purposeful. 2 riders. No male run, no traitor. He stood from the fence line, brushed the sawdust from his jeans, and walked toward the cabin just as the dust cloud crested the ridge. Sand stepped out before he could speak. She stood near the porch, her hands clean, her eyes focused. Not frightened, not even cautious, just aware. The dog stood near her side, ears high but not barking. Jonah had the rifle inside. He didn't reach for it yet. The riders came in fast and reined in hard enough to kick up dust over the porch steps. One was a man Jonah recognized from the post office in Comanche Hollow. Name was Merton, lean and nervous looking. The other wore a crisp vest and clean gloves, city-bought. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't look at Jonah. He looked at Sand. "Is that her?" the man asked. Jonah didn't answer. Merton cleared his throat. "Mr. Vex, this here's Mr. Larimer. He's a representative from Newfield Ranch, North Amarillo. They're looking to employ." "I ain't selling livestock," Jonah said flatly. "She's not livestock," Larimer answered, still not taking his eyes off Sand. "But she is unclaimed. Technically a ward of the state. The delegation from Austin's been delayed. Might not come at all. So there's an opportunity here, a legal one. Mr. Newfield has a need for reliable domestic labor. He's offering fair coin to take on a girl like her. Proper housing. Clean work. She doesn't belong to anyone," Jonas said, his voice hard. "No," Larimer agreed, finally turning his head, "but she's not exactly free either." Sand stood motionless on the porch, arms crossed, her expression blank. Jonah didn't look at her. He looked at Larimer. "Get off my land." Merton shifted in his saddle. "Jonah, come on now, this ain't personal. It's just business. The town's getting nervous. People talking. If you hand her over clean, no one's going to call it anything but cooperative. She's not going anywhere." Larimer raised his brows. "You'd interfere with state interests?" "I'd interfere with men who show up to my door with chains in their saddlebag." The wind picked up a little then, tugging at the tarp nailed to the side of the barn. The silence stretched. Merton looked uncomfortable. Larimer just stared. Jonah stepped down off the porch slowly. "Last time I asked. Turn around. Now." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't reach for the rifle. But something in the way he stood, in the way his jaw was set and his eyes locked dead center, made both men hesitate. Larimer sniffed once, adjusted his gloves, then turned his horse with a single tap of the heel. "You'll regret this," he said. "No," Jonah replied. "You will, if you come back." They rode off. The dust hadn't even settled when Jonah turned and found Sand watching him. He waited for her to speak, maybe to ask why. But she didn't. She just turned and stepped back inside. The dog followed her. Jonah stood there a minute longer, then did the same. Inside, the lantern was already lit. The cord she'd left on the table yesterday now hung beside the door, twisted and knotted like something ceremonial. Jonah didn't know if it meant anything, but it was still there, unmoved. That evening, they worked side by side. Sand made a thick stew with wild greens and beans. Jonah checked the oil in the lamps and repaired the loose shutter. The air felt tense, not between them, but around them, like something unseen had passed through and left its scent behind. He sat on the porch later, watching the sky turn red over the hills, the coffee cup cooling in his hand. Sand came out. She sat down next to him, Not close, not far. After a few moments, she spoke. They will come again. He nodded once. I know. She didn't ask what he would do when they did. She didn't ask why he had refused. And Jonah didn't explain. Because somewhere between their silence and their daily routines, that understanding had already formed. Wordless but solid. The listener might have wondered why Jonah didn't hand her over. What was she to him? A burden? A cause? But it wasn't that. It was simpler. She'd done nothing wrong. She didn't owe anyone anything. And in a world where men spoke too loudly about things they didn't understand, she had stayed still and kept her dignity. And that was worth protecting. Morning light cut through the cabin slats in long, clean lines. The air smelled like damp soil and pine bark. It had rained again sometime in the night, though neither Jonah nor Sayan had gotten up to check. They had slept in silence on opposite sides of the same room, the kind of stillness that now felt familiar rather than strange. Jonah woke to the soft clang of a pot being set down. Sayan was already by the hearth, stirring something. He sat up slowly, his wrapped hands stiff but healing. She didn't turn around to greet him, but she placed a folded cloth on the table, clean, dry, and clearly meant for him. There were things she did now that didn't need to be explained. That morning, he realized they had become habits. Quiet, daily patterns that said more than any conversation might. He ate at the table while she worked on weaving another cord, this one tighter than the last. He didn't ask what it was for. She didn't offer. That had become their way. By midday, the sun broke through and the ground began to dry. Jonah pulled the saddles out to oil them. Sayan joined him in the barn without a word, took up the other rag, and began working beside him. The motion was slow, methodical. He glanced at her once, caught her watching his hands again, but not in the same way she used to. There was no caution left in her eyes now, only awareness. When they finished, she followed him to the water trough, and they rinsed their hands together in silence. Afterward, he reached into the supply shed and pulled out a busted saddle strap, one he'd been meaning to replace for years, but had left in a box like so many other broken things. He handed it to her. Think it's worth fixing? Sayan turned it in her hands, running her fingers over the cracked leather, checking the stitching. Yes, she said plainly. She didn't look up, but the answer stayed with him the rest of the day. They moved together across the yard after that. He dug a shallow trench along the fence line for drainage. She worked the soil behind him, covering and leveling it. The dog followed them both, no longer favoring Jonah or circling Sayan suspiciously. The cabin didn't feel like it was his alone anymore. Not fully. The air inside wasn't just still, it was lived in. That evening, they sat outside as the sun dipped low. Sayan had started humming again, just a slow tune, almost without melody. Jonah didn't ask what it meant. He just sat there, sipping coffee from the chipped mug she always handed him first. He broke the silence. I was married once, he said. Sayan didn't turn her head. She just kept humming. But she was listening. He knew that. Didn't end right. She left without warning. Took what she wanted. Left what she didn't. Mostly me. The humming stopped. I stayed here, he added. Not because I loved the place. Because it was quiet. And I could forget things here. Sayan looked at him then. She didn't speak. But she nodded once. An acknowledgement. Not of what he'd lost, but the fact he had chosen to share it. That was the first time Jonah realized he wasn't just telling her. He was giving something up, laying something down in front of her that hadn't been spoken in years. And she hadn't flinched. She hadn't filled the silence. She just let it be. Later, as the stars came out, she brought out the cord she'd been weaving. Without saying anything, she hung it over the door frame, next to the old horseshoe Jonah had nailed there long before she arrived. He watched her do it, then asked, "What's it for?" "To hold a place," she said. And with that, she turned inside. He stayed on the porch a while longer, listening to the wind move through the trees, the soft creak of the barn roof settling, the last cicada of summer whining through the dark. There were still questions hanging in the air. Would someone else come for her? Was this arrangement permanent? Would either of them ever say what they were to each other? But they didn't need to be answered. Not tonight. What mattered was what had grown between them. Routine, presence, a rhythm that didn't rely on names or promises or past debts. And in that silence, Jonah felt something he hadn't in years. He trusted her, not because she'd earned it, but because she hadn't broken it. Jonah woke to quiet. No wind, no creaking wood, no distant riders. Just the sound of birds in the trees and the soft scrape of something being swept outside the front door. He sat up, rubbed his face, and looked toward the hearth. The fire had already been cleaned. The coffee pot sat over low heat. Sayan's blanket was folded, placed neatly by the bench. But she was gone. He stood, pulled on his boots without rushing, but the feeling in his chest tightened, like something had shifted in the rhythm of things. He stepped onto the porch. The air was cool, damp. The sky was washed pale, with mist clinging low over the field. Then he saw her. Sayan was standing at the edge of the pasture, alone. Barefoot, arms loose at her sides. She wasn't moving, just staring out across the land, toward the south ridge, where the sun rose slower and the horizon always looked like it went on forever. Jonah didn't call out. He stepped down from the porch and walked toward her. She didn't turn when he got close. He stopped a few paces behind. "You thinking of leaving?" he asked, voice low, steady. She didn't answer right away. Then, without moving her eyes from the distant line of hills, she said, "I used to think if I walked long enough, I'd find something waiting." Jonah nodded slowly. And now, her shoulders rose and fell once, barely a breath. "Now I don't look as much." They stood there a while. He didn't crowd her. She didn't explain. It was a different kind of silence this time. Not the silence of strangers, not the guarded stillness of two people afraid to speak, but the quiet that came after something heavy had been set down. After a minute, Sayan reached into the folds of her skirt and pulled out a thin braid of dried grass, tighter than the others she had made before, its center wrapped with a small strand of blue cloth torn from one of Jonah's old shirts. She held it out to him without a word. He took it. "You want me to keep this?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. He tucked it into his coat pocket. The rest of the day moved slower than usual. They both worked, but there was less urgency in it. Sayan gathered herbs from near the creek bed. Jonah repaired the shed's rusted hinge. They passed each other often, shoulder to shoulder, hand to hand, but without touching. Something between them had shifted again. The air wasn't heavy anymore. It was steady, understood. That evening, while she chopped vegetables for stew, Jonah sat at the table and finally spoke again. "Larimer won't be back." Sayan looked at him. "He knows I'll shoot if he tries." She didn't smile, but there was something calm in the way she nodded. "And the delegation from Austin?" she asked. "They're not coming," he said. "So if there's no decision?" Jonah met her eyes. "There is. It just isn't theirs to make." She studied him for a moment, then went back to her work. Later, after dinner, Jonah stepped out onto the porch. The sky was clear, stars bright, sharp, the kind of night that made the land feel endless. He heard Sam behind him, but didn't turn. She came to stand beside him. "You can leave if you want to," he said, quiet. "I know. I won't stop you." Sam looked out at the dark, then said, "Where I go doesn't matter as much as where I stop." Jonah didn't say anything to that. He didn't need to, because he felt it then, really felt it, that she hadn't stayed this long because she had nowhere else to go. She had stayed because she had chosen to. When they went back inside, she took her usual place near the hearth. He sat on the edge of the bed, watched the flame in the lantern twist and settle. In the drawer beside his cot, he placed the dried grass braid with the others. This one was different. This one he kept tucked under his rifle cloth. There were no promises between them, no vows, no plans. But the next morning, when he woke, the first thing he saw was her boots by the door and her coat hanging beside his. And for the first time in years, Jonah didn't wonder what came next, because she was still here, and she had stopped watching the horizon. The first frost came early that year. Thin sheets of white clung to the porch rails, and the breath from the horses rose in quiet plumes just after sunrise. Jonah stepped outside, wrapped in his coat, and scanned the pasture. The soil was beginning to harden, and the sky had that brittle clarity that always came before winter settled in for good. Sayan was already in the yard. She was gathering the last of the drying squash vines, moving slow but with purpose, hands red from the cold but steady.